Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am Allen Arthur. I am a graduate, 2016 graduate of the Newmark, well, it was CUNY at the time, but Newmark Engagement Journalism Program. I'm also the online engagement manager of Solutions Journalism Network. I'm based in New York City, and I am just freaked out excited to do this panel. I'm so happy I agreed before I knew who was on it. And then when I found out who was on it, I was so amped up. I'm so happy. Three people whose work is just really, really inspiring to me and who are really blazing a really great path right now. I'm just loving this. I'm so happy to be here. Why don't y'all introduce yourselves, and I'll just go in order. I'll go clockwise based on my screen. So Dalia, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Hi, my name is Dalia Jones, and I am the Director of Engagement at Texas Observer. I am originally from Deep East Texas. Shout out to Lifkin. And yeah, I do movement journalism at the Texas Observer.
Thank you so much. Ko, talk to us.
Cool. So my name is Ko, Ko, that's it. I promise you, I get more flack about them two letters than you would ever imagine. I'm based in New Orleans right now, but I call Mississippi home. And I right now am in the middle of doing the most. And so right now I'm an editor at Southerly, but have some exciting job announcements to come soon. I'm also still currently a general assignment reporter at the 19th.
Editing at Southerly, reporting at the 19th, and with more announcements to come. Okay, great. I'm exhausted already. Okay, Sierra. Hello.
Hey y'all. My lighting is just not cooperating today, and I'm a little upset about that, but I'm very excited to be here with y'all. I'm Sierra Hinton. I'm the Executive Director Publisher at Scalawag. Have also worked at Press On, which is a Southern collective for movement journalism, which is how I'm connected with Dalia and Co. I'm just like very delighted to meet you, Alan, but like over the moon to be on this call with them. And I also am a coach with the Facebook Journalism Project, Facebook Accelerator Program, and UNC Table States.
Oh, Matt. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so excited that I get to talk to you. I'm, like I said in the email and that I said on Twitter, I'm like, this is very exciting for me. I just love all your work, and I've got to encounter so much of it through working at Solutions Journalism Network. And if people have questions, I guess you can drop them in the chat, and I'll try to relay some of them, or maybe you can all see them. So we see some great ones, we can point them out. Just to set the stage a little bit for, I think, what we're going to get today, because we're going to be talking about engagement and objectivity and what those things mean or don't mean. I'm just going to display my new shirt for everybody. This is where we stand. We can wear our principles on our sleeves in here. We don't have to pretend like everything's fine, or I don't know, the little bit of this side and a little bit of that side. We can be honest. So I was thinking about dividing up the questions like by person, and asking them, directing them to one at a time. But I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't want to minimize. So I'm going to throw the questions out, and if that stops working, then I'll direct them to individuals. But for now, I'll start with sort of opening them up to all of you and see how that goes. The first thing I wanted to do also is I wanted to read a little quote that has stuck with me from a talk that Sierra gave, that she adapted into a piece that was published on Scalawag about power in journalism. And she said, we uphold power to the benefit of the same powerful figures we claim to hold accountable. Newsrooms need to start covering people's power and not focus solely on institutional and systemic power or the existing power of the privileged. And what's so exciting for me about movement journalism is that it repositions power and focuses on people power, and not just holding power accountable, but how do we foster more power for more power for people. So I'm going to start with this. The name of this panel is Engaging Communities in Service of Liberation. So what would you say to people who think that journalism's job is not liberation?
Okay. Whew. All right. So the thing about that is, right, it's like, if we're not fighting for liberation, then like, what are we fighting for? We already know that the status quo is not working. A lot of us are either invisible, being left out of the equation, don't have access to what we need. And so the only real solution is to imagine something different. And that something different is liberation. So it's not just like, why should journalism work in service of liberation? The question is like, why should all of us be working in service of liberation? And if journalism is the thing that you do, then I would offer that you should be doing that in service of the freedom of everyone.
I don't know why we being shy. Like, we all are not in a group text. Anyway.
I read your Twitters. Nobody here is shy. Come on, let's do this. Come on, we're here. We've got young minds to shape.
You're right. So I know I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially because I think, like, to be frank, obviously, a lot of journalism's failings were on display in the last 4 years of the Trump administration. And that gave us an opportunity. Now that we're out of it, right, we're able to see a lot of what the media is just trained to do, and you can't blame Trump anymore. And so one of those things when we're talking about power is that we continue to see that a lot of newsrooms do value access journalism, and they don't value it in terms of accessing the people who are most harmed. They see themselves as like, it's like a badge of honor to be proximate to the powerful. And the way I see journalism and the way I don't see that as journalism. We're not scribes. We are not here to publish tweets without context. And that's what Twitter is for. It literally does it on its own. And so what I've been thinking a lot about, just in terms of movement journalism and trying to define it, is like, the movement piece is important. And what are we trying to move away from, and what are we moving towards? Moving away from this idea that we have to tiptoe around the powerful, because the reality is some people have power, and because some people have power, there are other people who are being harmed. And my MO in this business is always going to be to talk to and uplift communities who are being harmed with dignity. And we can get into that, because there's a way to do it and there's a way not to do it. And I think we've all seen very ugly ways. But yeah, it's really about thinking like, who should have the power, right, in this country? It's not the people that probably already have it. It's the people who it has been pillaged from, and people who have resisted these power structures that have honestly ruined a lot of lives. And so I think that when journalism at its worst, it is aligned with the powerful, and that robs the potential to have people really see the power of telling their stories and using those stories to shape the world that we want to see.
Yeah. And Alan, can you repeat the question one more time?
It was, what would you tell people who think that liberation is not journalism's job?
I mean, isn't our job to tell the truth, right? And I think that truth is not only telling it, but also acknowledging the truth of our industry, the truth of the history of it. I'm always in my history bag. So like, if you ever talk to me, I'm always gonna tell you about some Texas history, something like that. And so I also think about, historically, a lot of freedmen's newspapers, right? A lot of publications that were started at, after Reconstruction, during the Civil Rights Movement, during the New Negro movement, right? And those are newspapers and publications that were in service of liberation, right? It was in service of truth telling and in exposing, what journalists or newsrooms who are keeping out, Black, Indigenous, brown people from those newsrooms as well. So, I mean, when people say it's not in service of liberation, I think more so the question is like, then are you really in service of truth telling? Because I think liberation is a big aspect of that as well.
Oh, we're off to such a good start. I want to put a super pin into Ko's statement, because I think journalists get caught up in like a one version of power, right? Like like there's the power of like police. I need access to the police because the police are very powerful, right? But there's another type of power that allows somebody to go into the neighborhoods that are over police, for example, and for people to take those people seriously or trust them, or to come in. I work with a lot of formerly incarcerated people. They're like credible messengers. A lot of times they go in there mediating disputes and things like that. That's a totally different type of power that journalism almost basically says is like not even worth digging into. And I find that access journalism is a lot more interesting to me than getting that trust and getting that access, and building relationships there is a lot more interesting. One of my questions is actually related to the Black press. And there's this huge debate around objectivity right now. And when you read about the history of the Black press, or pretty much all non-white, mainstream press, it's a very different relationship to objectivity. They are fully wear on their sleeves, like, we are here to uplift, support, protect our communities. That's what we're here for. So, I mean, how do you see movement journalism's relationship to the more traditional ideas of objectivity? I mean, it should be pretty clear that everybody involved here is not subscribing to the both sidesism of everything. But what do you see as movement journalism's position or relationship to these ideas of objectivity?
Can I share a story to answer your question? So one of the things, and I'm so glad Dalia has already framed this, that like, we love to talk about history. You should really see our texts. They're very nerdy. Sorry, no scandals here. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've done more of like thinking about my family and like my roots is that, and like my role as a journalist and like trying to, get rid of harm in this industry is, I like have recently adopted this thing of like, I call myself a Northern Southerner, because I've been very, it's not lost on me the fact that like my family is from Mississippi, like my great grandparents are from Mississippi, and I could have been like a third or fourth generation Mississippian. However, my great uncle, my grandmother's uncle, was lynched in the same county that I started my journalism career in. So in 1888, he's walking to church, white, he doesn't yield the sidewalk. This is what we know from the white press, right? This is what my family has, is the white press said, my uncle did not yield the sidewalk to a white couple who was walking to church. They came back, met up with him, and that my uncle apparently like met up with all these people at the store, shot into the crowd, killed a white man. They took him to a jail in Hinds County, from which he was later abducted and hanged in a cemetery. And that's what the white press says. So a lot of what my family knows about this ancestor is from that perspective. There's one Black press that wrote about my uncle. There's one that we can find. And the way that they framed his death was that he was a martyr. And there's two radically different things about and no critical analysis about an abduction from a jail. There's no due process. There's no quotes from him. We don't have any of that. We don't have anything from what my family was thinking about, because my family immediately left Mississippi and never went back after that. It's why my grandmother was raised in the North. It's why I was. And so I like looking at these two pieces. I think we see a lot of that still when we see things covered in the press. I know one thing that I'm thinking about right now is I know DMX passed earlier today, or we got the news, and already I saw the way that the Times framed the headline was that he was a troubled rapper, but had a like a grovelly voice. Okay, you know what I'm saying? Like if we're doing dignity work, if we are in service of who people are as full human beings, then we know that traditionally the press, when it comes to people of color, I'm talking about Black people right now, and the Black press was formed because there were just straight up lies or half truths. And the fact that we are still, when we talk about objectivity in journalism and the legacy of that, we're talking about the same legacy that wrote about my uncle as, you know, someone who could just be strung up a tree, right? With no more context than that, right? That's what my family to this day has about, you know, something that shaped my life, right? Centuries later. And so I don't do objectivity. And I think that when we say, like, you have to be clear about that, because that's where it comes from. People would have said that those articles in at the time, and, you know, like Dalia was talking about, you know, the Black press in Texas as well, that the Black press had an agenda, as if the white press did not, a clear agenda to perpetuate racism and to harm communities for centuries. And so I think we have to be very clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about objectivity, because that's the system and that's what we're trying to dismantle.
Yeah. And I also think about that historical aspect of like accountability, because I also think about, you know, who's allowed to hold people accountable, or, you know, what press is allowed to hold people accountable. And it seems, of course, like the trend is like the white press gets to make that decision. I think about, so last summer, last Juneteenth, I wrote about my upbringing in East Texas and kind of the violent history there, and kind of like living under that shadow, and how East Texas is a very, very undercovered region as well in Texas, just in general. You know, during my research, I remember even going through news articles about the Longview race riots, right? The Houston riots that happened, as well as some other, it's just a lot of violence. And it was really interesting on kind of looking at kind of what the white press was kind of depicting compared to the Houston Defender, right? Which is like one of the first Black presses in Houston, and who kind of helmed up not only just like local stories, but also artists in the area too. So I totally agree with Ko, and I just kind of want to harken back to that accountability aspect. When we say we're holding people accountable, you know, it's that objectivity conversation. It is a privilege to feel like you can be objective. It is a privilege to feel like you can take off your identity or take off whatever to enter into a room and not have a specific opinion. I cannot take off my identity as a Black queer woman. I cannot take off my identity as somebody who was raised in rural Texas, who experienced poverty, who experienced disasters, right? But that insight can help me tell that story as well. So I think that it's about time, especially with journalism schools and a lot of these legacy publications, to kind of come or kind of look at themselves in the mirror, to kind of, you know, really reflect on, like, you know, is it objectivity, or are you stifling, or are you filtering certain opinions because they make you uncomfortable? So
I'll relay very quickly. One time I was talking to a journalist, talking to somebody who does restorative justice, a formerly incarcerated person who runs a restorative justice organization in Brooklyn. And we were talking about journalism, and he said, it's so, like, the number one thing he wants is for journalists to bring themselves into the room and offer up something of themselves. And I was like, do you know that is the opposite of what we're taught in journalism schools? And he was like, that's crazy to me. You're coming in to talk about our worst moments, and you're at work. You're at work right now. I don't know anything about you. You're an institution. Your child services, your police, your therapy, your institutions. And I don't know you. You're at your job. What do you care? And I thought that was so like the idea that we're all supposed to take off what we believe, where we came from, whatever, is kind of crazy. And Noella, I saw your question in there. I hope if you didn't see it in there, how am I just supposed to shut off my whole being while reporting as a Black queer woman just to be objective? I think this panel would probably say don't, but I'm sure you have a lot to add to that.
Yeah, don't do that. But like, I also know that that's like hard, right? Like, it's a real privilege that I, one, get to like lead a newsroom, and that in that organization, we have values that allow for our whole personhood. Most folks are not out here doing that, and they're not allowing for that. And a lot of that is rooted in their own privilege and internalized oppression. So like, I understand it's like easy to say like don't, but also like showing up as your whole self, as long as it's safe, it's definitely a form of resistance. It is, yeah, I would just say like something I would encourage you to continue to do. But also like, here's my plug always. This is why funders need to give money to Black-led organizations so that we can create the spaces that are inclusive, so that we can model for other folks how to do this in a way that values folks' full humanity, right? We can't wait for these white-led organizations to decide to get it together, to go through their anti-racist training and figure it out. Like, it's not going to happen. At least not at the speed that it needs to happen. But what can happen is that those of us who actually know how to do this work can create those spaces, can model it for other folks, and really, just be a point just be a model and be able to show people how to actually do this. So it is my hope that one day I can just hire everybody, and you all can come work at Scalawag, and we can, really help make a systemic shift in this industry.
Related to that, this is great. I had a bunch of questions and I was like, are these even going to work? And that we just are touching on everything. So this is great. I've found that in doing reporting, mainly, I work with people who either are or have been incarcerated. And I found it's very powerful to have an explanation of why you're reporting on a story that goes beyond, this is important. People need to know about this. And it strikes me that movement journalism, it's my experience with engagement journalism too, is that it's really not what people expect. They really expect something extractive, that people are going to come in and interview them about the worst thing that's ever happened or the terrible thing that's going on, and then write a story about it. They're not really expecting you to be present when there's no story. They're not really expecting you to be building a relationship or even having a perspective on it that is intended to uplift them. So how do you, when you're out doing reporting, how do you describe your work to people that are your, for lack of a better term, sources that you're interviewing or having discussions with around stories as you're reporting? Like, how do you frame this for them so that they understand where you're coming from?
Yeah, I think a lot of what journalists, at least should be doing, I know the ones that I stand for do this, is like, there's going to be an element, there's always an element of my work of media training, so to speak, right? Like, I want people to know, this is what I'm thinking of, this is what's in my mind that I see as an injustice. This is kind of, I'm hoping that you can like come to trust me to tell your story. And this is what I'm hoping the story will become, whether it's a podcast, print, whatever. And I'm going to be talking to you for however long, months, weeks, years, so that you have an expectation. And then also letting people know, like, I'm probably going to be learning a lot about your life, some of which you are okay with me knowing, but that you don't want the public to know. And that's okay for us to kind of negotiate those terms, right? And I think that just that there's a core difference, right? That I'm gonna approach relationship building with a Black mama in Mississippi, for example, versus the district attorney who is prosecuting her son or something. Like, we don't have, that's different. And so I think for me, like, a lot of what that, like, I think that work should just be baseline, right, for journalism, period. But I find more and more that it's not, like, and that's kind of why, like what you were saying, Alan, about this idea that when a lot of times when journalists do it, and part of why I do that, like media education pieces, because a lot of people, when they think of journalists, they think of the 10 o'clock news, right, which is all crime and no dignity stories, or they've talked to they have a bad experience, or someone they know has been scorned by a journalist in the past. And so that shows up in the room too, when we are coming into whether you are a movement journalist or not, whether you know what I mean? Like, you are a person who is working in the media. So you bring that legacy into the room. Like, we all know, we can all point to stories where we're like, that was harmful, that was wrong. And people don't know how the avenues to fix those things. And so I think, like, just slowing down, I love slow journalism. I wish that we valued more of it, because it really does make a difference. I think that the stories that stick with people are those stories that you can tell the reporter spent, either like the essay that Dalia was talking about, where she's talking about her home. So she spent her whole life rooted in that. So of course she's, whatever she produces out of that is going to be out of love, out of education, out of a duty to like see the stories that she wanted to be told about her home, right? Or it's just, so yeah, I think that like slowing down and just letting people trust you. What Sierra just said in the chat is so important. This idea that like things have to go now, and it's like on my time, and like this is the news, and like this idea that something could be late, like, oh, what's the news hook? Are you joking? Because like some stuff, it's just like, it's never been told right, or it's never been told at all, or this person's story, this person, needs this. And yeah, I'll stop there, but I just really believe in that idea of just like a slow roast, basically.
Yeah, and I do kind of want to reiterate what Ko said, and especially as somebody who's coming out of reporting and into like the engagement arena. Like one thing I think is just really interesting about this like little quote unquote reckoning that we're having in news right now is that a lot of us don't realize that we have to repair a lot of those relationships. We really, we want to hire diversity. We want to hire what we feel like is diversity and then go into these communities, assuming that we're going to get better coverage and better subscribers, or what, however your publication is supported. And I was actually just going on a rant about this the other day about how, like when me and Zakaria's, she works with me on our current project. And for those who don't know about our project, essentially we're spending the next year going to 8 different regions around Texas and surveying communities of color specifically about what their information needs are, how they actually get information, how they're actually consuming news, and kind of what coverage they feel like needs to be prioritized. But a part of that, because we're asking them to give us feedback, right? Because we're extracting in a way, what can we offer as a media publication, right? To not only like build a relationship, but to repair. And a part of that is not only having critical conversations with town halls, but it's also doing media training. How can you combat like disinformation in your community? How can you reach out to a news reporter, and how can you know the terms of on the record, off the record? And then also, how can I ground you in the foundation of like community storytelling 101, so that you know how to raise and lift up your own voice or share information in your community when nobody else is able to listen to. And so I just think that that's how, like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of legacy publications in Texas specifically, especially the ones that are covering policies, especially the ones who are covering our very colorful state government. It's a nice way of putting it. I would have probably said something else on Twitter. But, I think it's just really interesting on how they want more diverse voices as well as more diverse stories. But first of all, you don't even hang out with like Black people outside, Black, brown, or Indigenous people, outside of your newsroom. Like you only go there when you're obligated and you're paid for it in the first place. Also, like, are you showing up to these areas without your mic, without your recorder, right? Are you like reaching out and building a bridge? And that's kind of like what me and Zakaria are. We realize like, as part of trying to get more stories in the important regions that we have been like looking over this whole time in our state's history, like we have to rebuild those relationships. And then we also have to show people that they're an obligation and that they're not a money sign, right? And that we're not trying to get donations from them, but we're trying to lift their voices up as well. I think it's been beautiful, like this. So essentially the project is a research project, right? And it's been beautiful kind of seeing the feedback from communities that we haven't been in. So Nacogdoches, right? It's right next to my hometown. I knew that Nacogdoches was one of the places we should go because it's the oldest town in Texas, but also if you look at the demographics, it's been hit hard with little coverage and inaccurate coverage at that. But hearing the community members being like, thank you for making us a priority. Thank you for thinking about us. Thank you for giving us energy in a way, because, in East Texas, you've seen movements, but you haven't seen mass movements like you would have, right? In like in Atlanta or like, in a New York or something like that, right? You're talking about rural, historically disenfranchised in rural areas where there are pockets of Black and brown and Indigenous people. And so it's just been like really interesting kind of realizing that like, maybe more newsrooms need that gap filler, right? Maybe more newsrooms need to prioritize repairing that relationship rather than just going out to report, so.
there was, let's see, where am I? There was a great question in the chat about workflow. Does doing this type of journalism change your workflow at all? Or is it just a matter of kind of pivoting from what you were already doing? We talked a little bit about slowing down. That helps. Sometimes newsrooms don't let you do that, but it's ideally, if you're doing this kind of work, slow down. Particularly in engagement work, you often don't have a lot to show for a long time. You have to be there and listen and put in the hours and the time. But does it change your workflow at all?
I know this was a Ko and Delia question, but I just want to jump in and share. Like, so for us at Scalawag, we are literally in the process of changing our whole workflow because we've recognized that, like, what Ko said about slowing down is like so important, right? Like, we need to slow burn these stories. We need to be able to go back to follow up and to let the storytelling happen over time. And so we're actually moving from publishing like 4 or 5 times a week to 1 story a week. And that story is going to go deep. And we're going to, also our editors have their verticals, but all editors are going to be a part of like telling that 1 story every week, so that we make sure that we have diverse perspectives on it. Because we just feel like that's like what is necessary for us to be able to do this in a way that like honors the communities that we are in relationship with. And we just realized like the hustle of mainstream journalism is just, that's not us. And so we're gonna do things our way, in the way that we know, honors our people. And so we will keep y'all updated on how that goes, but we're super hopeful that this will serve us and serve our communities in the way that they should be.
I also wanted to just say this is a house that stands Scalawag and a house that stands Sierra, as well as Ko, of course. But I realized too that movement journalism has changed kind of my approach to communities. But I also realized that, for me, there's been a bigger push for changing the ways that we do processes, like in the newsroom in general. Like, we can't ask for people to make strategies. We can't ask them to lead projects without willing to make that internal change as well, and also reckon with the same issues and patterns that like newsrooms have historically had as well. So,
yeah, this question about workflow is super interesting because I probably think about burnout all the time, but I just think about, like, and I talked to Delia about this, LOL, recently, just about this idea of like being really tired and just in general, but like balancing that with the work we do, which is like deep listening, which is like community building, which is sometimes like working through, people, I've been in so many living rooms where people are like, I've never told them, this is my first time I've really had a space to talk through some of these things, because people have to just move on with their lives in so many ways because capitalism is really trying to kill us all. And the reality is I've, especially at the 19th, like, I know I can crank out a story in 15, 20 minutes if that's what's required, right? If the news is moving, whatever, that's what I need to do, I can do that. But the stories that I think really stick with like readers, stick with people that make a difference are the ones where I've had to carve out that time. So I know the question was about workflow. That means like, all right, like I'll get this little story done about whoop-de-woo and blah, 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 and he say, she said, la, la, like, okay, cool, got it, great. It's on the site. Now I'm gonna carve out the rest of my afternoon to, read through these hospital records or FaceTime this mom or whatever, so that I can spend more time building up this story that I know is important. And so I know that like, I've definitely like, even just a couple years ago, went way, like, I don't even know how I was doing what I was doing a couple years ago. I was working at 2 like national newsrooms on like 2 huge intensive projects. And like, after that, I finished the project and I was like, I'm happy about the project, but like, I'm exhausted. And I just don't like the feeling of sitting with people who are like sharing so much and are really bearing it all and not being there like fully. Like I need rest, right? Rest is resistance, right? That's my thing right now, is like, how can I be as rested as possible so that when I do show up and when I am talking to people and when I am piecing together big narratives, I am at my best, right? Like I am at my strongest, I'm present. And I think it can be really hard to figure out how to juggle both or all those things in service of these stories, while also making sure that I'm going to be okay as a human being at the end of it, right? And through it. And so that's kind of my new thing, is like, I'm not trying, I think that just like journalism can feel like such a race sometimes. And I'm like, who are y'all running against? Like, for real, like I'm not trying to outrace y'all. Y'all can get the story up first. Congratulations. You know what I mean? Like you won the Twitter race. You got the Twitter moment. Claps for you. My sources aren't on Twitter. My sources are in rural Mississippi. They don't have broadband internet. So I don't care about that. I think people need to shift, like, what's your goal here? Like, is your goal to get 50,000 followers and feel in a blue check? Congratulations. You know what I'm saying? You can get that. You can email Twitter tonight and get your check. But what is that going to fix? You know what I'm saying? Is that going to fix, you know, the fact that like some of the things that my neighbors are going through, you know what I'm saying, that we talk about on our porches, they ain't on Twitter. So I think just keeping that at the core of it is so important to me. And like, you know, more people need to really, if you're in journalism, to compete against other journalists, then say that. But I think that more people have to be clear about what they're trying to do. And like, which is, you know, why I say with my whole chest that I'm a movement journalist, and that's what I'm trying to be in service of, is justice, period.
And I kind of want to, I'm sorry to just jump in there, but I kind of want to just like lift up what Ko said, especially as like somebody who is actively learning themselves how to rest. I think that it's also important. I'm going to go back to the money conversation, that like grantees, funders, you know, whoever is like funding your particular project, that they understand that a lot of that reparative work is going to take time, right? I think about the fact that Texas Observer has like the first Indigenous Affairs desk in Texas, right? And we know that it's going to actually take time to repair the relationships with a lot of Indigenous folks who are in the state, right? I also think about the fact that with this project, you know, we have a year-long deadline. But we've been hit with a winter storm. We've been hit with COVID, of course, right? We're experiencing a lot of racial uprisings right now. And I think that it's just important that journalism have enough imagination or be flexible enough to understand that a lot of that stuff just takes time, and that the time will be worth it. But because we are constantly trying to feed a monster, I think that that's the issue, right? And so like the hope is, you know, and I'm with Sierra and Co, is to kind of change that monster, or kind of to kind of take down that monster, right? Because I mean, that was one reason why I went into engagement and why I really, you know, did this project, is because I've constantly felt like when I was reporting, I was screaming into the void, right? I'm reporting the story, but like, what is the point if our newsrooms and our structures aren't changing in the first place too? So.
This is wonderful. And I think also, if I'm hearing part of what you're saying correctly, and I was had a kind of question orbiting it that I had written down, but I don't want to say it's a drawback, but something to consider as you do this work is that it may take a toll on you that is deeper and more personal than a traditionally objective, removed journalistic enterprise. Reporting on restorative justice and living through it are two very different experiences, and you may not expect what you're stepping into sometimes as a journalist. And the sort of flip side of gaining trust is that people hand you things that you are not always expecting, and that can be very intense. So as we scope out the world of journalism that we want, we also have to be realistic that it's not rainbows and butterflies. You know, there's a toll in this work, and I think this is coming up a little bit in this.
I do want to just add in there too. I'm sorry, I'm
Please.
rude.
No, jump, please.
I do want to add too is like, you know, we understand, you know, in responsible newsrooms, of course, like understand that a lot of these communities are kind of working from a deficit, right? They're disparately impacted. And when we have people who come from those communities to report for us, we also have to understand that they're also working from that deficit as well, right? What traumas are they bringing into that newsroom and carrying with them, right? What are the things what experiences are they carrying with them? And how can you as a newsroom support that as well? And then are you paying them adequately for doing the extra work of repairing that relationship with a particular community as well? I honestly feel like non-white hits is like journalists should be getting paid extra for a lot of the extra work that we are doing for a lot of newsrooms, because a lot of them are not paying us as consultants, even though we are working as consultants. So
we can't go on without getting to Terrence's question that came through the Q&A, but also was pasted in the chat. For people who haven't seen or can't access the chat for some reason, how do y'all deal with or overcome class barriers, sexism, differences, and other forms of oppression within our communities? How do you have authentic communication that's still respectful and honoring folks' lives and experiences, and bringing your full self that's often stripped by white supremacist spaces we have to bend to? That's deep. So how are you having these conversations in a context where being your whole self is not always welcome, or the system is pushing you into different shapes?
I always remember that, you know, thinking back to the civil rights movement, like it wasn't all Black people like protesting. Not everybody was marching. Not everybody was out here doing the work. And sometimes it's going to only be a few of us, but also just like holding space for people, having empathy, understanding that we all live with white supremacy. As Black folks, we are all dealing with internalized oppression. And yeah, just like holding space for that very real reality, and like, yes, holding people accountable, yes, pushing them when we can, but also like, you know, what like like what are you supposed to do under this violent system? Like I when, you know, Black folks are homophobic, when they're transphobic, when they're xenophobic, when they're all of these things, it's just like, to me, it's more heartbreaking than anything, because I'm like, damn, like racial capitalism got us out here wilding. White supremacy has us out here looking a mess. Everybody, white folks too, like we all need to divest from this system. But also like understanding that it's a journey, everyone's in a different place. You know, that's why at Scalawag, part of our work is this consciousness building. That is what we see. One of the purposes of our journalism is because like we know everybody is like not born a critical race theorist. Like that's just not true. But like, what can we do to help facilitate that learning and bring folks along? Because like all of us are going to need to come along in order for us to get to liberation.
Yeah, I think like these are such good points. And I think that there's a lot of questions about, you know, I don't know, people who, what am I trying to say? Let me just speak directly and frankly. So I think that like what you're saying is so important here about this idea that like people holding space for people. Like I'm thinking about the person that I was before I ended up going to Spelman, HBCU in Atlanta, Georgia, like truly, truly scary who I might have been if I had not been in a space where people were patient with me. And where I was in a place to learn. That is a place where people are paid to teach me, right? And I say all that to say is that like, as someone who is often the only Black person of color, even in a lot of these spaces, like these journalism spaces that I'm in, piggybacking a little bit off of what Delia is saying, this idea that like, I'm gonna end up inevitably, frankly, doing this consulting work that you could, and there's too many resources. You know, Google is too free, right, for you to not have education on really any ism, right, any fracture in our society that you want to know about. And I think that where it fails when I'm the only person in the room is that there's a lot of people who are thinking like, okay, this is how it is for the Blacks, right? And it's like, that's just so unfair, because I'm also, you know, within my community having these conversations, trying to move the needle about, you can't say stuff like that. We can't, you know what I mean? And just doing that education. And I think it just like comes from doing, like, I think about just the idea that like, yes, we are trying to dismantle these white supremacist ideals in our own communities as well. Because the way it shows up can be so harmful. And I think that we miss that white supremacy is at the core of all these things. The way journalism is harmful, it's white supremacist values. The reason why we have all these fractures, I'm thinking about with all the AAPI violence, and why we're having conversations in silos in Black communities about, oh, is that our business? And Asian communities are like, well, Black people this, and it's like, hello, white supremacy is doing its work here. And it's winning, it's tap dancing, hooting and hollering, like that's not what we're here for. And so I'm in a place now where the way I show up in my community I'm, you know, hoping to move the needle here and there is the same way that I'm trying to show up in these newsrooms to say, this is not it. You know, because I think that like, it's very easy to cultivate these spaces where, and there's a lot of, you know, newsrooms happening every day, people trying to approach journalism differently every day. And I think that like really making sure people are doing what they say that they want to do. If you are in service of justice and liberation, then you have to be prepared, right, to do that work in your community with yourself, especially if you are in a position of power, right? It is not anybody else's responsibility to do that work for you. And so, yeah, I think that like with that, there's no both sides, right? There's no both sides to homophobia. There's no both sides to racism. There's no both sides to any of those things. And so, yeah, I'm trying to do better about like getting people to do the education on their own, but also holding space for when people, like when you do want to call people in, you know, I'm thinking about my own mother, right? Like the conversations that we have, like I have space for her, that's my mama.
Oh, okay, Terrence, thank you for that clarification. I would say like the answer there is the answer like it is everywhere else. It's all about relationship building. Like, you know, I grew up poor, but I also had access to like educational opportunities that like just gave me a lot of access, right? And so, you know, for me, when I am moving in spaces where we're centering poor and working class people, understanding all of the privilege that I'm coming into the room with, like I'm still going to show up as my full and authentic self and depend on like me being me and making connection with folks as they are. So it's really no difference. Like the answer and the root is always relationship building.
I wanted to ask, you know, again, I always talk about this at the engagement school too, is that a lot of times we're talking about the world we want journalism to be, and that can oftentimes be very different than the world that journalism is currently. So a lot of times people may feel very passionate about this style of work, the engagement side, the movement side, both. I think they interconnect a lot. But people out there may be a bit nervous to kind of label themselves this or indulge in this work, quote unquote, too much, in the sense that like they may be nervous that they're going to be marginalized or looked at as like activists, the dirty word, as though like all journalists aren't trying to be activists for something or other. What tips do you have for people who see themselves as movement journalists or see these kinds of principles as core to their work, but don't want to be marginalized within the industry?
So can I answer this as somebody coming out of NPR? Like when I tell you that press on baptized me, but I feel like, as somebody who was taught, especially, I love my journalism school, love my professors, and, for a time did love, working at NPR, but I realized that a lot of the things that I was being taught, a lot of the ways that I was treated within the newsroom were not part of my values. And it did make me feel good as well. And I realized, like, even as I was doing my reporting, the type of reporting, which was movement journalism based at the time, I didn't really know that. It was getting a lot of pushback in the newsroom. And I don't know, I just say to that person or those people, like, you have to kind of shake shit up. Sorry to cuss, but like you gotta shake shit up. Like, I'm a professional shit talker. You can tell on Twitter, ask my friends, look at my group text messages. That's what I do. I'm from the country, it's what we do. But you have to be ready to kind of like to stretch beyond the confines that a lot of these newsrooms put on us in the first place. And if you're not allowed to kind of be yourself in that space, to call yourself a movement journalist in that space as well, I know people need jobs, but like, do you need to be there? You know what I mean? Like, there are other options. There are independent newsrooms. It's not like that's the only option. And so I think it's kind of like that deal where it's like you're screaming into the void. What is the point in doing the work if you feel like it's not going to be effective or it's not going to influence anything enough? So
I know Delia said that she loved her professors at her journalism school. I did not love most of my professors. I went to Columbia Journalism School after Spelman. It was a terrible year. And part of it is, I think, because I just recall all these conversations that I had with professors that were like, oh, like, it was just like this whole thing of like scary hour when it came to like talking to activists. It was like, don't, be careful when you're when you're quoting activists, like they have an agenda. And I'm like, don't I have an agenda? Like, ain't I trying to get a story done? Like, I'm trying to get paid. Like, I also have an agenda, right? Because I came up with this story idea and you greenlit it. So you have an agenda. So like, what are we talking about here? Let's be clear about everybody has an agenda, period. Two, this whole idea that we can quote activists and organizers, but they can't do their own storytelling is white supremacist AF. I won't say the F word because I don't know, my mama might watch this recording. I see the little red dot up there. So I won't embarrass her because she raised me better than that. But I'm serious. Like, that used to really, I was like, so you mean to tell me I can spend 3 hours with this organizer? I can go to the rally. I can, quote their policy stances. But then if I called myself like affiliated with the movement and I want to see the same justice done, all of a sudden I'm throw the whole, burn it down, delete her account, like get her out of this whole institution. It doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And I think that's one of the things I'm so excited about working with Press On, and one of the announcements that I have coming soon, TM, is this idea that like people can do a lot of times. And I think that this is a hard truth for a lot of journalists to swallow, is sometimes we talk about holding space and making space. Sometimes you need to get out the way to make the space. Sometimes it's not your story to tell because somebody is better positioned in their community to tell the damn story themselves. So maybe you should use your knowledge and your tools to help that person do what they need to do to write their own shit. And so that's where I'm at with it, is this idea that like someone from DC needs to fly into native country, right? Go door to door, shoe leather, knock, hello, nice to meet you. I don't know anything about your language or whatever, but I'm here from this publication. Get out of the way, like, and I don't want to hear your vantage point. I don't want to hear your drone flying in to do that. I want to hear the people who are rooted in it, who are vested in it, because at the end of the day, you're gonna fly back home and file that story and get back on your little blue check Twitter and move on. And that's where I'm at with it, is that I'm in a place where I'm trying to work with people, right, who are most impacted to do the storytelling themselves, because they can do it, but they have been disempowered to believe that they can, or that they even have a story to tell. About to cuss. I'm done.
Oh, mega underline to everything. Amazing. Yes, 2 huge valuable lessons in there. One, journalists don't have to just tell a story. We can do other things. We can help people tell their own story. We have other things we can do except sitting around writing stories all day. And two, yeah, if you're not going to be somewhere where you can do what you want to do, it might not be worth it.
One thing
Yeah.
about me, I quit a job. That's all. Go look at my
Yeah.
LinkedIn. One thing about me, I quit.
This is amazing. But time is up. I want to talk to you for 8 to 12 hours, but I'm sure you have lives and stuff. I have a child. I should probably do other things too. But that doesn't mean I don't want to talk to you for 8 to 12 hours. This was wonderful. Thank you all so much. I learned from you many days, but today I learned a lot all at once. And I appreciate this window into your group texts. I appreciate your candor, and I hope everybody in the chat, if the chat is any indication, we got everybody, you got everybody fired up. So this is good. That's what we want. So thank you so much, everybody. If people want to find you all, where should they look? Twitter, where's the
We
best
just be
place?
on Twitter talking to each other. So if you find one of us, you'll find the rest of us.
That's awesome.
I think, yes. Oh, thank you, Dalia. Yeah, find Dalia and then you can find us.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Newmark School, and Carrie and Jeff and Melissa for having us.